Well, first of all, thank you for leaving what is obviously a very important and challenging and entertaining presentation downstairs. I almost felt like skipping this and going down there myself, but I appreciate your being here and winding your way here. About the summer of 1980, I was living in Hartford, Connecticut at the time, and was taking the train to New York, where I was going to spend the weekend, and had taken with me for reading in the train, not that it was a terribly long ride, a brand new book the publisher had sent me for my review. It's called Conspiracy by Anthony Summers, which would go on to become, for me as it is for so many people, one of the real seminal works in the assassination. And I'd gotten to the point in the train, I think we had just passed the halfway point to the station in New York, and I was reading about this incident that Tony talked about, where Lee Oswald purportedly asked to make a call to area code 919, and he then proceeded to talk about this as well. And I looked at that and I said, area 919, that sounds very familiar. Okay, I'm sure I'll think of it. And I went on, and about 10 seconds later, I realized that's my area code because I was born and raised in Raleigh, North Carolina, and had moved to Hartford from Raleigh. And so, needless to say, my attention was immediately galvanized. So, and the publisher that was publishing my work at the time was in Raleigh, and so when I got back to Hartford after the New York weekend, and by that time I had devoured all of Tony's book, I called up my publisher, Bernie Reeves, and I said, Bernie, if you're interested in another article, I just found this segment, and I read it to him, and there was a little silence on the end, and he says, write it. And I said, okay, if I write it, you'll publish it, fine. So later that summer, we had the first of the Raleigh Call articles that he and I would publish. The immediate response was so amazing there in Raleigh to hear about the fact that there was a Raleigh connection that he called me in Hartford. He says, get your posterior, but he used another word, down here. We need to, it was a weekly publication. He said, we need to get another article for next week's publication. So I immediately drove back to North Carolina, and he and I spent the entire week on the phone doing more interviews and so forth, came up with the second article. The history of this publication, very briefly, is that in the 90s, the publisher of the Third Decade Journal asked if I had something on the Raleigh Call that could be published in there. And I said, well, you know, I've been thinking about taking these two articles, bringing them up to date a little bit, putting them together into one, and you're welcome to have it. So they published that. And thus began my 30-year career now with the Raleigh Call. So that's my little slice, and I appreciate very much the fact that so many authors have picked that up, not only from me, because I picked it up obviously from Tony, and it had been in Canfield and Weberman's book as well, and other books. Jim and others have used this. It remains what it was when I talked to Bob Blakey for the article that we were writing. It remains, as he called it, real, substantiated, very troublesome, and deeply disturbing. He's not a man to mince words, as we know. Blakey went on to say that while this, of course, is only a very small part of a much larger issue and tragedy of the Kennedy assassination, it raises questions that remain, and this again, quote from him, remain unanswered, makes inferences which are ultimately inconclusive, and is therefore an unanswerable mystery. Well, with that kind of introduction from an obvious expert in the field, I thought I was onto something. So here's what I was onto. And the reason I brought up this background is because as part of my preparation for this, I am preparing a much larger revised, updated, and expanded version of the article. It's already 3 times its original size because over the years I have been checking with the slow process of the release of the declassified documents from National Archives and have pulled all of them that are germane to the Raleigh call. I have taken the contents of that, published them on my website, so they're available in their entirety for anybody who wants to see it. And this article will replace the abbreviated version sometime between now and November 22nd. So I encourage you to go and look at it. But the conversation that you and I will have today will be including all of that new information. And there is actually one new thing that has made the original publications about the Raleigh call out of date and inaccurate, and so we'll get to that as well. But for those of you who perhaps have not read what the details are, here's all it is. At some time between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. on that Saturday, November 23rd, word came down from the jail to the switchboard in the Dallas jail building, the municipal building, that at some point Lee Oswald was going to want to make a couple of phone calls. They talked with the senior switchboard operator at that time. There were 2 on staff that evening. But they talked to the senior one, Mrs. Louise Swinney, and said that when those calls were going to be made, they would send down a couple of men who were going to monitor that. And of course, reading that in a 2014 context, I'm thinking, okay, Miranda, protection, privacy, okay, I guess none of that appealed to them at the time, but nevertheless, they were going to listen in and get all the information they possibly could about that. Little did she know exactly what was going to unfold with that. So the call didn't come till finally, sometime around 10 o'clock, Oswald attempted to place the first of his calls, and Mrs. Swinney, when she would talk about it later, would remember that the person he wanted to call was, and this is a quote from her, lawyer Apt, A-P-T. Well, of course, she was referring to and remembering wrong the name of John Apt, the attorney in New York who was something of the staff counsel for the Communist Party in America. And a very well-known figure at that time. We'll come back to that in just a minute and what the fruition of that call was, because the Raleigh call is not that call, obviously. Sometime between 10:15 and 10:35, the lady that was working with Mrs. Swinney had asked to get off early that night, and so her replacement, who normally wouldn't replace her until 11, came in early, again, sometime between 10:15 and 10:35. The lady that had been there left, and the new one who came in, a woman by the name of Mrs. Alveda Treon, sat down at her area of the switchboard. And Mrs. Swinney told her there's going to be a call coming up from the jail. They were on the 5th floor. The switchboard was on the 5th floor. That Oswald would be attempting to make that call, and that 2 men would come down and monitor the call. So Mrs. Treon said, okay, and we'll just see how this unfolds. Mrs. Treon's daughter, who also worked for the Dallas Police Department in the records department, also was to go on duty that night at 11 o'clock for a shift, an 11 to 7 shift like her mother. So she came down with her and joined her in the switchboard, or went up, I suppose. And when she heard that, she said to her mother, if he makes the call, write down the information. We should keep that as a souvenir. And Mrs. Treon agreed that that's what she would do. And sometime after 10:30, the light on the switchboard came in, indicating a call coming up from the jail, and they both knew exactly what that meant. According to Mrs. Treon's testimony, she and Mrs. Swinney both plugged into the switchboard at exactly the same time, both opened up the key to the call, and Mrs. Treon actually was the first one to say, "Number, please." But at that point, Mrs. Swinney, whose shift it really was, according to Ms. Treon, she said, I saw that she wanted to handle the call, so I let her take it, but I continued to listen in, and I heard everything that Lee Oswald said to her about the call that he wanted to make. And so she took a telephone slip that they had to fill out at that time. Anytime a long-distance call was made, the process in the Dallas Municipal Building was that a slip giving the information of the time, who was responsible for the call, who it was going to, what the telephone number was, what the area code was, had to be filled out, had to be filed for accounting purposes. They had to know where to bill the call. Mrs. Treon had one of those pads of paper in front of her, and she proceeded to write down all of the information that Oswald was giving to Mrs. Swinney. And so at that point, when he had given her all the information, she disconnected the key so that he could not hear her, but was still there on the line. And what happened next is sort of transformative into the weird realm of all the other things that happened in this case that seem not to have an explanation. And I'll pause here and kind of leave you sitting there because so many speakers at this conference so far have put us right on the edge. I remember yesterday when we kept trying to get him to finally tell us what was the man's name who did the Kubela extraction. That I thought, you know, this man has a flair for the dramatic, and I'm going to try to do the same thing. I titled this particular presentation today, the Raleigh Call and the Fingerprints of Intelligence, because if it is true, and if the things that happened according to the written record of the time, as it appears that it did, and according to the testimony of Mrs. Swinney and Mrs. Treon and others, then it has a very real potential to speak to who Oswald was. Was he involved with intelligence in the United States? Did someone want him to think that he was having some sort of role in American intelligence, or what? And so we are reminded of the famous quote from Senator Schweiker, which everybody has used in their books and presentations. We don't know what happened, but we do know Oswald had intelligence connections. Everywhere you look with him, there are the fingerprints of intelligence. Schweiker, of course, working with the subcommittee of a subcommittee that was involved with the Kennedy assassination during the intelligence hearings in the Senate, was in a position to know that, and he was very forthright about making that statement. But switching back to November 23rd, 1963, just before Oswald had placed the call upstairs and both Mrs. Treon and Mrs. Swinney plugged in, a knock had come on the door, and it was procedure that the door be locked for security purposes anytime at night or on the weekends. So Mrs. Swinney gets up, opens the door, and two men dressed in suits, not in uniforms, came in. Mrs. Treon said that Mrs. Swinney introduced them by their titles or who they worked for, but she didn't remember whether it was homicide or Secret Service or who it was. They were placed in an adjacent utility room where they could monitor the call. So we come back to the point where we left it just a minute ago, where Mrs. Treon has said, "Number please," and Oswald has given this information. Now, that souvenir that Mrs. Treon's daughter wanted when Oswald, and I read one account that said at this point that Oswald's plight was becoming dire, and I'm thinking, wow, that's the understatement of the year, that he was reaching out at this point on Saturday night, first to lawyer Abd, and now it seems to someone else, and the souvenir written on one of the telephone slips that Mrs. Treon filled out tells us exactly what she says she heard Oswald try to connect with. And it was this. Now, you've seen reproductions of this in books and magazines and so forth. I sat down one afternoon and did a redigitization of it to get rid of all of the garbage that had accumulated after a series of Xeroxes of Xeroxes of Xeroxes, and to make it as readable as possible. But that's what has emerged. And we'll come back and talk about the individual elements here in just a minute, but this is where things stand. Mrs. Swinney has written this information down and is getting ready to act on it. Mrs. Treon has written it down because she's going to take it away as a souvenir. And she has signed Mrs. Swinney's name because Mrs. Swinney was the one actually attempting to make the call. So Mrs. Swinney, what we would say today, puts Oswald on hold, connects with the two men that are next door in the utility room, talks to them, listens to them, according to Mrs. Treon, begins to get very nervous and shaky to the point that it was quite noticeable. She disconnects from the two men in the room next door, is still visibly shaken. She sits there contemplating, thinking, waiting. We're not sure exactly what she was doing. She gets back on the line with Oswald, and to the great astonishment of Mrs. Treon, says, "I'm sorry, sir, the call failed to go through." Disconnected from Oswald, and that was the end of that. The two men came out of the utility room, thanked them for their cooperation, and left. Soon thereafter, Mrs. Swinney left her job because her shift ended at 11 o'clock, and Mrs. Treon was there all night to think about and to remember everything that had just happened and try to make sense out of it. Now we have to do a little fast forwarding, because you will look in vain in the 888 pages of the Warren Commission and in the 26 volumes of evidence to find anything about this particular incident, because it wasn't known. Mrs. Treon felt that whoever it was that needed to know about this, and whoever those official people were, that was sufficient. They didn't need any more information from her. Whatever they needed to know, they had found out. Fast forward about 4.5 years, Mrs. Treon and her husband and family have moved from the Dallas area to Springfield, Missouri. And over a dinner conversation with a friend of hers and her husband's, a man by the name of Winston Smith, who worked for the local federal penitentiary there. Doesn't everybody have one in their backyard? She mentions, oh, by the way, I had this really bizarre thing happen. I was in the switchboard in the Dallas jail on the night of Saturday night when Oswald was in custody, and here's what happened. And Smith, with his background in law enforcement, thought, I'll bet someone wants to know about this, because it would have been clear to anyone who had followed the case at all that no one had ever talked about this in the 4.5 years since the assassination and the 3.5 years since the Warren Commission report came out. So in early '68, he calls her back a few days later and says, I'm going to tell Sheriff Owen about this because I think he really would want to know, and at the very least, he'd find it interesting. She said, fine, whatever you want. And so the sheriff comes and talks to her, sees immediately that she's normal, and that was his word, that she seemed to have no problems with reality or maintaining her ability to speak and to be articulate. And she also says, oh, and by the way, I still have that phone slip if you think that would be of any interest. Well, yeah, probably would. So he goes away, knowing that it's above his pay grade. So he calls a man that he knows that is a special agent in the Springfield office of the FBI. And so they come and talk with Mrs. Treon. And her first-person account of those conversations with the FBI was actually quite positive. She said that the men were very interested, they were very polite, they were very thorough, and it seemed clear to her that they had never heard about this story at all, that they were hearing about it, as she said, for the first time. She showed them this telephone slip, and they said, may we take this away with us to make a copy, and we'll make sure that you get it back. And she said, well, sure, yeah, very forthcoming. And so they did, and they left, and some time went by, and she had not gotten her phone slip back. And so she called the sheriff. Sheriff said, I'm on it. And he, by contacting the FBI, was able to get her slip back to her. And that, she thought, would be the end of anything that she would have to do with this. She had seen her duty and done it, as they say in the old movies, and felt that that was everything that would be expected of her. And she was a little wrong in that part. Now things began to get strange, as if they had not been already. Remember Winston Smith, who was the friend of the Treons, who had initially seen something here that needed to be looked into. He would then tell the House Assassinations Committee, some 10 years later, when they asked him, that a week, now I want you to keep that 7 days in mind. This was his words exactly. You can look it up in those declassified documents. A week after he told Sheriff Mickey Owen about this, he, Winston Smith, gets a call from a national journalist whom he thought the first name was Ian and the last name was Caldwell or Calder or something, but he couldn't really remember. And this journalist was calling him in Springfield, Missouri from New Jersey, saying, I understand that you know about this call that Lee Oswald attempted to make and that you've talked to the lady that was in the switchboard, and we just wonder if we could get some more information from you. And he was astounded, as I was when I read that document, because that's the first I'd heard of that, that literally 7 days after the first law enforcement person has ever heard about this, a journalist in New Jersey has heard about it and is already seeking some information. It took just a little while and a little bit more digging into the documents from the National Archives to find out who Ian Calder was. And blow me over with a feather, as they say. Ian Calder at that time was I think he was about a 28-year-old cub reporter. I don't know if you could actually call him that. He was a born Scotsman. He'd gone to London, and National Enquirer hired him in London after some years' experience that he had working for some newspapers there in the United Kingdom. Hired him to head up their London bureau. And then in 1966, they moved him back to New York, where he was living in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And so between 1966 and 1968, when he called Winston Smith, he had started taking a great interest in the Kennedy assassination, and somehow or another, through the sheriff's office in Greene County or the FBI, and I would probably bet he more likely had contacts in the latter, he found out about this and was calling all the principals about it. Ian Calder retired in the year 2000, and he retired. He was quite a resourceful and very talented man and worked his way up, and he retired as CEO and president of National Enquirer in the year 2000. Still with us, by the way. He lives in Florida in Palm Springs, and I have not contacted him yet and may not, but nevertheless, that's just another one of those little dangling things that ends up out there. So let's go back for just a second to our phone slip and see what this tells us. Again, if we take it at face value, and from now until I tell you, we're going to assume that this is to be taken at face value. We'll come back and examine it critically in just a moment. What this tells us, and what Mrs. Treon said she heard with her own ears, coming out of Oswald's mouth via the telephone, was that he wished to make a collect call, which of course would have been the only kind of long-distance call he could have made from the jail, to Lee Harvey Oswald from the jail wanted to make a call to Raleigh, North Carolina, and he gave her, and she mentions that he gave to both ladies 2 telephone numbers, and wanted to speak to a John Hurt. He gave no middle name or initial. The date, of course, was Saturday the 23rd, and it was in area code 919, which was, and still is, Central North Carolina. She then added these codes over here, which they used in the switchboard, and which we'd all wondered about until we found some additional documents from Mrs. Treon later. She said, I added this because DA means did not answer. Of course it didn't, it was never placed. And the call was CA canceled, and that's what those things mean. So that's what that tells us. But going on beyond there, what do these 2 telephone numbers mean? And I'm going to just dispose of the second phone number very quickly, because the House Assassinations Committee did exactly the same thing. 833-1253 in area code 919 in the years between about 1960 and 1966, and that's as far back on either side of the assassination as I went, on either side, belonged to a man named Henry W. Hurt, and I believe someone else has found out that his middle name was middle initial stood for William, though I actually haven't seen that confirmed in any of the official documents. And that he seemed to be a person of no interest to the House Assassinations Committee. You will, of course, search in vain through the entire published report of the House Assassinations Committee to find any information about the Raleigh call, but that does not mean that they didn't spend a lot of time looking at it. Obviously, they knew all about it. They spent a lot of time, in those documents you'll see they spent a lot of person hours and airplane miles to try to get at the bottom of this. So by the time it was over with, Blakey, who was kind of a micromanager when he wanted to be, knew all of these details and was able to tell me on the phone in 1980, shortly after they had published their report, all of the things that he knew about how real and substantiated, troublesome, and disturbing the case was. So in the report that was written by the group of counsel and investigators that had looked into this, even though this report was never included in the Select Committee's final report and not even alluded to, but in this report that was written by staff counsel Sorrell Brady, she alludes to this second phone number only 4 times, and only to say the first time that it was one of 2 numbers, second time that it was the number that for some reason Winston Smith had memorized the one time he had seen the phone slip, one time to indicate that the other John Hurt that we'll talk about in a second didn't know who that was, and the 4th time to indicate that they didn't pursue it any further. I have heard reports, and I've never seen this verified in any kind of official document, was that someone had determined that this belonged to a young man who worked in an auto parts store in Raleigh, barely out of his teens. I cannot support or verify that, but whatever it is they found out, they never reported on it, and it never entered into the record. Probably because of what they found out about John Hurt number 1. 834-7430 was the telephone number of John David Hurt, who was, oh, by the way, our friends yesterday are not the only ones that can go out on Ancestry.com. John David Hurt. John David Hurt, among the many things that we can and will say about him, was a special agent for U.S. Army counterintelligence during World War II, between about 1942 and 1945. He told the researchers that from the House Assassinations Committee. He told me that when I interviewed him. He told Tony Summers that. And more important than any of that is the DOD confirmed all of that to the House Assassinations Committee. It is beyond question. What does that mean? Lee Oswald, calling someone with the history of working in American intelligence, when he was, of course, as Arlen Specter and all of them would tell us, was the lone nut who had no connections at all. I want to spend a couple of seconds just going through what we know about John David Hurt to give you a sense of who he was in 1963, because he was definitely just a shadow of a person that he had been during the war. He received commendations, by the way, for his work, and when the war was over, the Army offered him a commission, which he did not accept. And given the way his health would deteriorate after that, it's probably not a bad thing. But John David Hurt, born 1909 in Colorado. He went to military school for high school. He took a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Virginia. He told me on the phone, he said, but I never practiced. Before the war, he had gotten some experience as an insurance investigator. And in 1939, in Raleigh, where he had ended up as an investigator, he married Billy Greer, and Billy would remain his wife till he died, and then she would die several years later. As I said, in 42 to 45, he was an Army counterintelligence special agent. 47 to 43, he acted as an investigator for insurance and other kinds of corporate clients. He worked as an accident evaluator for the North Carolina State Motor Vehicle Department until in about the second year of his employment there, which would have been about 1955, it was discovered that he was offering preferential treatment to certain outside vendors when they would need to contact them. And he was given the opportunity to resign rather than being terminated at that point, and which he did. And at that time, his health and his mental health began to deteriorate. In 63, his phone number and name came to appear on that phone slip, and his demon battle with alcohol, which had started in the late 50s, was raging by the time of the the late 50s. By the 60s, he was very much in the bottle. And one doctor told the State Bureau of Investigation in North Carolina that he had diagnosed Mr. Hurt as manic depressive, paranoid, and dangerous to society by the end of the 1960s. So that was the man that was on the slip. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever, and in fact I don't think there ever will be, because I don't think it would have been true, that Lee Oswald knew John Hurt. And similarly, no evidence whatsoever that John Hurt knew Lee Oswald or even knew of him until the weekend of the assassination. Mr. Hurt, when I talked to him in 1980, said, you know, I was always kind of a fan of the president, and he said, if anything, I would have been more inclined to shoot Oswald than to talk to him on the phone. And I wondered, after I had found out about his medical and addiction problems, if that was maybe some of that talking at the time, or whether that was his Army counterintelligence coming through. I'll have a lot more to say in my article when it comes out about what the DOD and the Veterans Affairs people said about his career as a counterintelligence special agent, which I don't have time to go into today, but I will commend that to you. The house that he lived in, it was actually a rooming house in downtown Raleigh, is now, and I would love to have been able to substitute for this slide, a historical picture of the rooming house, which is actually kind of famous, 1 block away from the State Capitol building in Raleigh. The address, for anyone who knows Raleigh, it was 201 Hillsborough Street, and it's now the parking lot and jogging facility right next door to Campbell University's law school, which is just across the street. So where are we with all of this, and what does it mean that Oswald attempted to call a man by the name of John Hurt and gave 2 phone numbers, both of which were assigned to men named John Hurt, but 2 different men? And at this point, we have to go into the realm of speculation, because what you have seen constitutes the entirety of the actual evidence that exists. John Hurt is now dead. Mrs. Treon is now dead. Mrs. Swinney is now deceased. There is no person or trove of documents or undiscovered depositions or anything like that that we can go to that will tell us anything that we don't know. Jump forward just a little bit to the early 70s and mid 70s. Researchers began early on to find out and to tell each other about the fact that the Raleigh call existed, and here's how and why that happened. Somehow or another, after Mrs. Treon had talked to and been interviewed by the FBI in her home in 1968, a document appears seemingly out of nowhere that she had not seen and would not see for another 10 years, written in the form of an affidavit, 2.5 pages, legal-size paper, typed on a typewriter with carbon copies made. We know that because I've actually handled one of the carbon copy pages. And it sat out there and people began to get copies of it circulating around. By 1970, Paul Hoke had gotten a copy of it and had written a position paper that he had his opinion about it, and which we'll come back to when we do a critical analysis. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. And so that's where things stand. That affidavit would show up as a piece of evidence that was filed in, let me see, the Assassination Information Bureau's files. Yeah, Bud Finsterwall's files. Yeah, now part of the Assassination Archives and Research Center. And when the House Assassinations Committee was founded, Jim Kossman reached into the files, a file marked Treon, by the way, pulled out this 3-page unsigned, unnotarized, obviously if it wasn't signed it couldn't be notarized, document, made a copy of it, sent it along with its Exhibit A, which was the phone slip, and sent it to the House Assassinations Committee and said, we thought you'd like to know about this. And that's what started their level of investigation. In the mid-'70s, as I indicated earlier, Canfield and Weberman's book and also Tony Summers' book at the end of the '70s came out with information about that. And when I interviewed Summers about it after getting back from that train trip to New York and was writing my article, Tony very candidly told me, he says, you know, that's the one thing in the book that I wish I hadn't put in there. He says, because the more I've thought about it and the more I have looked into it and found nothing to support it, he said, the more I just don't think it's real, it doesn't sit right with me, and since I can't verify it, I wish I had not put it in the book. And I said, okay, I will duly note that. And in fact, I had already written that up to go into the article that Summers was not happy with it as a piece of the pie. A few days later, literally I think within a week, Tony called me back and he says, you know, we were talking about this call to Raleigh, North Carolina. Yes, sir. I've changed my mind because I was just on a television interview program with Robert Blakey. And he said after the interview, we were talking out in the parking lot, and he said, probably because your call had already brought this back to my mind, he says, I mentioned to Bob that I'm really sorry that I put that one thing in about the Raleigh call. He said, because I just don't think that it deserves to be in there. And that's when Blakey surprised the heck out of him and said, no, you've got that wrong. The call is real. It went out from, the direction was out from Oswald. It was not a crank call into the jail. We verified that. We're sitting on that. We just don't know why or who or how or anything like that that connection was made. And he said to me, I just wanted to call you back and tell you, okay, after talking to Blakey, I'm glad I put it in the book. So that's where we stood. That's where those articles were written. And then later, of course, some critical analysis of this began to happen. I mentioned to you that Paul Hoke had written in 1970 that he felt, after looking at it, that it probably was not a real thing, and it probably was not a real call from Oswald going out. And here's what he thought. In the original affidavit that mysteriously appeared and we assume was typed up by the FBI, though we don't know, it says that after Mrs. Swinney closed out the call, didn't make the call for Oswald, told him it didn't answer, and everything was over, the affidavit says Mrs. Swinney tore off her notes that she had made and threw them in the trash. And that later, when Mrs. Swinney had left her position for the evening and Mrs. Treon was there by herself, she went over to the trash can, pulled that information out, and wrote up the phone slip that you've seen. And so that being all he had to go on, he says, that's pretty tenuous. He said, here's what I think happened. I think that the call that Mrs. Treon was in the room for was the call to Attorney Abt, and that when she went fishing in the trash can, what she really came up with was information about a crank call from an alcoholic former Army counterintelligence person from back way in World War II into the jail cell, trying to get at Oswald, trying to talk to him or whatever. And so she took that information and wrote it up, and that was what she said. And that has a ring of evidentiary nothingness because, like everything, we have nothing to base it on, but it's logical. And it could easily have happened that way, except for the fact, and we didn't know it then because until the files were declassified and finally released, we didn't know that the House Assassinations Committee had sent to Mrs. Treon this affidavit, which Mrs. Treon had no clue existed, sent it to her in 1978, 10 years after it had been created by whomever, and said, would you please verify that the information here is correct, or correct it if it isn't, and do you have any indication about this that either rings true or not? She wrote back and she said, I've never seen this before. I would never have signed it because of the inaccuracies in it. And the major inaccuracy that she pointed to was the trash can. And she said, I never went through the trash can. I don't have any idea what Mrs. Swinney did with her notes. It was totally unimportant to me. She said, they may have asked me what Mrs. Swinney did, and I might have said, well, normally we'd just throw them away. But she said, I don't even remember saying that. She said, I was on the phone. I listened to it. I heard Oswald's voice say those words. I wrote them down contemporaneously with the call coming in from the jail. And that has a tendency then to suggest that maybe those who thought it was in reference to a crank call coming in may have a little bit less of a room to stand on. And that, in fact, was the conclusion of Sorrell Brady and her group from the House Assassinations Committee, who were writing up their final report and said, we believe that Mrs. Treon's testimony to us and her emendations to the affidavit have a ring of truth. We don't know why John Hurt. We don't know who he was. We have no indication he was involved at all in the assassination, so we can't go there. But we believe what Mrs. Treon said. It was a ringing endorsement. So that's where we stand. Does this, in fact, mean anything? And now we really go into the flights of what if. Because does this, as Cyril Wecht said today, does this sound like the actions of someone who was the lone nut that Arlen Specter and the rest of them wanted us to believe? And just as the answer for Cyril Wecht was no when it came to the bullet wounds, it's no here. The point has been made that a call like this is absolutely perfect spycraft. In that second set of interviews for the second article that Bernie Reeves and I worked on together, we called Victor Marchetti, and because Tony Summers had pointed us in that direction. And we talked to him at some length, and in my article I post the relevant portions of the dialogue that I had with him. And I said, we're trying to figure out what this means, and in the context of someone who had been in intelligence, and perhaps someone who thought he was working for American intelligence, perhaps someone was trying to convince him that he was, what does this mean? And Victor Marchetti said to us in no uncertain terms that if he had seen this happen with his own eyes, he would be absolutely convinced that someone had told Oswald that if you ever get into trouble, and if you ever have a problem, first of all, don't call us directly. We don't want anybody knowing who we are. And here's what you do. You call John Hurt in Raleigh, North Carolina, and you talk to him, and he'll get to us. Now, why John Hurt? Why John David Hurt? Why that phone number? Why is there a second phone number? Well, there are many possible explanations, but we don't know, and they're not verified at this point. If he had been told John Hurt in Raleigh, North Carolina, I've demonstrated, contrary to what Southern Bell Telephone told the House Assassinations Committee, I have verified beyond any doubt whatsoever that both of those numbers were listed and available. So anyone calling directory assistance, or what we used to call at that time information, and given the name John Hurt, Raleigh, North Carolina, would have been given those two numbers. They were not unlisted. They were not unpublished, as the telephone company told the House Assassinations Committee. So Oswald could have called, memorized those two numbers, or written them in his notepad that he had, and given those to the operator. Again, could have, might have, we don't know. But one thing is that Victor Marchetti was absolutely convinced that it was no accident that Oswald was behaving like an intelligence agent in the field, and whether he was working for American intelligence, my personal opinion, maybe 10% probability that that's true, or someone was stringing him along, using him, and making him think that he was working for American intelligence, much more likely in my opinion. This is the kind of spycraft that he would have been given to do. It at least fits with the facts that we know, and that's as far as we can go. The last thing that Victor Marchetti said to us was that, this fits in with the O&I operation that they had going on down at Nag's Head, where they were working with disaffected young men who had washed out of the service, the American Armed Services, training them to become double agents and defect to the Soviet Union. Let me think. Who does that sound like? And he said, it's entirely possible. He said, I've always thought it was very possible that Oswald, after his stint in the military, where he decided on his own that he wanted to learn how to speak Russian, that maybe he would have been directed as a Marine, all right, still the Department of Navy, would have been directed to this O&I program and might well have an explanation there for his sojourn to the Soviet Union. Again, might-haves, could-haves, no real proof that that is the case. So that's where we are with the Raleigh call at this point. I found this screenshot of Victor Marchetti. It had been a long time since I'd actually seen a photo of him other than that one in the upper right-hand corner. But he's the one that gave us all of that background on spycraft. The three books that I had used at that point that had involved and had given me the work that I had done, Canfield and Weberman, Summers, and of course Douglas's work, which has kind of summarized things at this point. Canfield and Weberman, interest from the standpoint of the Kennedys. In fact, be inclined to take the same action Ruby took. I would have loved to have put a bullet in Oswald. He told Canfield and Weberman that, as well as telling me that. Summers, today former CIA officer Marchetti, draws attention to the telephone number, which related in '63 to a subscriber in Raleigh. Marchetti points out this is the same general areas in North Carolina as the North Carolina base where, according to him, O&I once planned infiltration missions into the Soviet Union. Again, unless further research resolves it, it just sort of stands there. And then Douglas has basically written in his book that it stands as is, and the House Assassinations Committee's summary that Mrs. Treon was probably telling the truth as she experienced it. Final thing, information provided by Mrs. Treon. This comes from Sorrell Brady's report, which again, unpublished until it appeared on my website, and it's still there and you can read the entire thing. Her daughter, Mrs. and Louise Swinney, all indicate Oswald did in fact attempt to place a call to from the Dallas jail on that night, but who John Hurt was and what was going on with that, we don't know, and who those law enforcement officials were, we don't know that either. So that is Oswald as we know him. It is one more glimpse. It's one more tantalizing little thing out there, and we don't know if how that stands and where it goes from here. This was referred to yesterday, and I love it. This is, it's just one more piece of fuel to those people who would mock this and the Onion satire, Kennedy slain by CIA, Mafia, Castro, LBJ, Teamsters, Freemasons, 129 times from 43 different angles. That's the response that we have gotten, and we all have gotten when we tried to work with the media on this. I would encourage you, if you have an interest in such things, the Raleigh Spy Conference put on by Bernie Reeves, my former publisher and my great friend. The Raleigh Spy Conference is one of the best things. It's where, as someone described it, it's where old spies go to sell each other books. And but it really has a great deal of interest every summer. And that's what I have for you today. Look for that article if you have any interest in it. My website's up there, and sometime between now and November 22nd, that expanded article will be there. I know we run a little long, and I apologize for that, but if you have any questions, we can kind of move out of the way and let the next people come in here. I'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much.